Traoré didn't clear it with advisors. He didn't whisper, didn't wait for protocol. He stood up at that summit with dozens of African leaders watching and said what no one expected to hear, especially not from a sitting president. On live camera, the moment he spoke, the entire room changed. Journalists froze. Mid-keystroke. Translators paused. And when he uttered the words, "Mr. Netanyahu, Africa is watching you," and what it sees is shameful, there was no mistaking. What had just happened? It wasn't diplomatic language. It was a shot across the global table, and it hit. This kind of moment is rare. African leaders have long been boxed into a playbook. Cautious diplomacy, neutral statements, deflection from controversy. Broke that tradition completely. He wasn't representing a country. He was channeling a continent. His voice didn't waver. It didn't rise. It remained because calm, when it comes from conviction, is more terrifying than rage. He wasn't pleading with Netanyahu. He was indicting him, and the timing couldn't have been more precise. The Gaza conflict had reached a boiling point. Civilian casualties were piling up. Global protests were flaring, but world leaders stayed quiet. But silence, Traoré knew, was louder than words, so he spoke. Not because it was convenient, but because no one else was. And he chose his moment well. When the world tuned out, Traoré stepped in. That is what defines a statesman, not his followers, but his willingness to stand alone. Every sentence he delivered was deliberate. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to, because the silence between his words carried more weight than any applause. He said, every time a hospital is turned to rubble, every time a child screams beneath concrete, and every time you call it self-defense, you're not protecting your people. You're isolating them. That wasn't diplomacy. It was moral confrontation, and it hit different. Not just in Israel, but in Washington, Paris, Brussels. This wasn't about policy. It was about humanity. Within hours, the speech exploded. Online, Telegram channels, Twitter, Instagram Reels. Activists cut his speech into TikToks with subtitles in Arabic, Wolof, Zulu, French. Protesters in Nairobi were chanting his words by sundown. In Dakar, a student stood outside the Israeli embassy holding a sign that read, "Our weapon is unity. Our truth is spreading." The quote had already become legend. This wasn't an organized movement. It was ignition. One spark, and suddenly Traoré wasn't alone. He was the voice of something much bigger. Western media, they didn't know how to play it. Some ignored it. Some buried it under fluff. CNN ran a short clip. France 24 trimmed it down. The BBC used the word controversial in the headline. But elsewhere, Al Jazeera, Press TV, independent African outlets, they ran the full thing. No cuts, no commentary, just Traoré S-words. The difference between how it was covered. That's the new global divide. Not East versus West, not North versus South, but filtered versus raw, controlled versus unfiltered. Netanyahu's office didn't release a statement. But inside Israel, senior officials privately expressed concern. Why? Because this wasn't a Hamas leader. It wasn't Iran. It wasn't someone they could easily dismiss. It was a head of state, African, young, popular, and rising. If he'd made a military threat, it would have been easier to spin, but he didn't. He made a moral one. That's harder to counter, because it doesn't trigger a defense system. It triggers doubt. And the warning wasn't just for Israel. Traoré's speech was aimed at the architecture of global immunity. It's a system that lets weapons flow into Gaza while the world pretends it's complicated, he said. If your government continues to target the defenseless, don't be surprised when Africa stops calling you a leader and starts calling you a war criminal. That line? That's the one they're trying to scrub from news cycles, not because it's inflammatory, but because it's legally accurate. Now the question isn't what Traoré said, it's what happens next. Because that speech created a ripple. Ripples turn into waves. The African internet exploded. Hashtags like #Africa will not be silent, and #TRAORE speaks truth are trending. Young people are printing out his quotes. Rappers are sampling his lines. He didn't just speak to leaders. He spoke to a generation. They heard him. loud and clear. The idea that a single speech could shift the mood of an entire region might sound exaggerated. Until you remember this: moral courage travels faster than policy. And Traoré's courage has crossed borders. Already students in South Africa are petitioning the government to issue a formal condemnation of Israel's actions. Activists in Ghana are calling for a boycott of Israeli-made tech. This is what happens when someone says what everyone else is afraid to. It wasn't even a long speech. Just 94 words that changed the temperature of an entire continent. That's what makes it terrifying to Western power. Because you can't bomb a sentence. You can't sanction a principle. You can't drone strike moral clarity. Once it's out there, once the internet catches it, you can't contain it. And now Netanyahu faces a problem. Responded, you fuel it. Ignore it, 10. You look weak. Try to spin it, 10. You risk amplifying it. There's no safe playbook anymore. Because the world has seen the clip. And worse, it believes it. Because it's not just truth. It's truth spoken without fear. And that's rare. What Traoré did wasn't just diplomatic defiance. It was strategic disruption. He cracked a silence that had lasted for decades. For too long, African voices were expected to be cautious, deferential, grateful. Traoré didn't ask for permission. He took the mic. And that sound? The sound of a continent. No longer waiting for approval is louder than any missile. Analysts are already drawing comparisons to Thomas Sankara. Same country, same clarity. Same refusal to be managed, but this time, the difference is tech. Sankara didn't have TikTok, Traoré does, which means his message is now immortal. Not in textbooks, but in phone screens, comment sections, protest banners, viral reels. This was not just a moral stance, it was a media move. A geopolitical statement disguised as a viral clip, and that's what terrifies the status quo. Because they know. Once the youth pick it up, once it becomes cultural, not just political, there's no walking it back. It's not just a headline, it's a movement. Traoré's final line wasn't a flourish. It was a challenge. He said, "History will remember who spoke and who stayed silent. Choose wisely." That wasn't poetry. That was a dare. To every leader in that room. To every viewer at home. To every government hiding behind neutrality. The dare was clear: pick a side, and suddenly, silence has become a side. Neutrality isn't neutral anymore. It's cowardice. That's the new world Traoré just stepped into. One where the price of inaction is exposure, where staying quiet feels more dangerous than speaking out. And where one African president just made it impossible to pretend you didn't hear. The entire O is watching. Youth groups are mobilizing. Telegram is lit up. And now, rumors are circulating Traoré might speak again, this time directly at the UN. Not an apology, not a negotiation, but an escalation. The second speech, bigger. Audience, and maybe this time he won't stop at naming names. This isn't just a viral moment. This is the beginning of a realignment. One where African nations realize they don't need to ask permission to lead. One where the global South stops playing the supporting role and writes its own lines. And one where silence finally runs. Out of power, Traoré didn't just give a warning, he broke something. Something that might not get repaired. And as the world scrambles to respond, one thing is clear. This wasn't the end of the conversation. It was the start of something far bigger